Through the ages, there have been many forms of control practiced by the powers that be. In each point in time, it has been necessary to understand how these forms of control operate, so we might navigate them and gain some semblance of freedom. That remains true for our current time. In order to grasp contemporary forms of control, we need to understand how it developed and is distinct from past forms of control, so we don't misunderstand what we are faced with. To do this, we'll be discussing Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison, where he chronicles the transformation from feudalist to modern forms of control. From there, we'll be looking at Deleuze's description of the transition out of modern forms of control and into postmodern forms of control, which are still developing to this day. Let us begin. In medieval times, crime was seen as a personal attack against the monarch. Thus, punishment for crime was the king exercising vengeance against the criminal through corporal punishment, such as flogging, hanging, torture, and many other examples, some too gruesome to talk about here. All this was done publicly to display the monarch's power over his subjects. As such, in medieval times, control was exercised by suppression of the people by the monarch. This form of control, however, was, according to Foucault, often very ineffective. If the public thought a punishment was unfair, it was easy for them to know where to direct their anger. Indeed, at times the public would gain sympathy for the condemned man and revolt against the monarch. Again, according to Foucault, this was a major reason why prisons and the accompanying bureaucracy was invented. Power was separated into different fractions, the police and the courts being the most obvious examples. This disbursement of power make it more difficult to organize opposition against that power, as what you are opposing is not a single person, as it was with the monarch, but an entire structure. Furthermore, the goals of punishment also changed. Rather than being about revenge, it became about deterrence and reformation. Standardized punishment developed as a tool of deterrence, by ensuring that crime X equals punishment Y. The idea being that as a potential criminal contemplates committing a crime, the associate punishment will immediately come to mind, thereby deterring the criminal activity. Reformation is, on the other hand, a bit more complicated. Foucault writes that the goal of reformation is not to make someone a functional part of society, but to make them into what he calls docile bodies. That is to say, a willless, soulless being who exercises complete unquestioning obedience with authority. This is achieved through a number of mechanisms, one of which is the timetable, where one's actions are steered by the hands of a clock rather than by one's own will, thus depriving subjects of any sense of autonomy. Here, Foucault starts to draw parallels between prisons and other institutions, like schools, factories, hospitals, and the military. He continues by elaborating on how institutions exercise control by means of normalizing judgment, hierarchical observation, and examinations. Normalizing judgment describes the mechanisms by which a norm is established, where deviance from such norms is endowed with shame, stimulating conformity to that norm. Hierarchical observation is a process by which you are observed and judged by someone outranking you in the social hierarchy. The implication being that you will be condemned if you deviate from the norm established by normalizing judgment, further establishing obedience and conformity to that norm. Foucault describes hierarchical observation as an architecture that is no longer simply built to be seen or to observe the external space, but to permit an internal, articulated and detailed control, to render visible those who are inside it. In other words, there have been developed structures by which you are rendered constantly visible to the people outranking you in the social hierarchy, who, as a consequence of their position, can condemn you for deviating from the norm. The consequences of this visibility are that you watch yourself from outside of yourself in order to anticipate condemnation and avoid it. As such, you start to police your own behavior in order to conform with the norm. Finally, the examination are the means by which you are measured to establish whether you are deviant or if you conform sufficiently to the established norm. All these mechanisms of discipline come together in what Foucault calls panopticism. This is a concept he creates based on Jeremy Bentham's panopticon, a structure in which its subjects are rendered constantly visible from a tower, but because of how the light hits the subject, they can never see if they are being watched or not. The knowledge that you might be seen at any moment creates the illusion of always being watched. As such, you act as though you are being continually observed, examined, and judged in accordance with the norm, without there being a need for an actual person to judge, observe, or examine you. You complete all those duties yourself. In short, disciplinary control is exercised by stimulating repression in the individual, rather than exercising suppression on the individual. Interestingly, Foucault notes that in feudal times, the monarch was in the spotlight and his subjects were in the shadows, rendered visible only as an extension of the monarch's display of power. In contrast, after the prison was erected, it is the subjects of control who are now in the spotlight, and rendered constantly visible in order to be reformed, while the source of that control, the bureaucracy, is left in the shadows. This is something we can recognize in our contemporary experience as well, considering that we are rendered constantly visible on social media. But something about our visibility on social media is very different from what Foucault described. Our visibility appears to be voluntary, while at the same time doesn't appear to stimulate suppression in the same sense. The reason for why our postmodern experience is different from Foucault's analysis is because we have moved on to new forms of control. In the 1990s, the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze wrote a text called Postscripts on Society of Control. In this text, he describes how we are moving away from mechanisms described by Foucault and into new forms of control. He observed that the institutions examined by Foucault was declining, and the enclosed spaces of the school, factory, and prison was giving way to endless open spaces. Deleuze notes that enclosures are molds, distinct castings, but controls are modulations, like a self-deforming cast that will continually change from one moment to the other. What better example of what Deleuze is describing than social media, an endless open space where there are constant flows of information moving without limitations, but where the rules of the game are constantly changing. There are no norms to conform to on social media, no molds to fit into. Instead, to be successful on social media, you must always follow the trends that change from one moment to the next. On social media, you are expected to constantly reproduce those same trends, else be judged as outdated. But you are always too late, because the trends change so fast they can never actually be achieved, but must always be chased. Fascinatingly, at the same time as you are expected to reproduce trends, postmodern culture also expects you to constantly express your inner self. Combined with the expectation that you reproduce trends, this has two distinct implications. Firstly, any expression of individuality is absorbed into the broader conformity with the ideal of non-conformity, effectively eradicating any notion of self-expression, as you just come to express the cultural ideals. Secondly, the fact that you are expected to conform with trends at the same time as you express your inner self implies that your self is supposed to reflect the trends you reproduce. In other words, your social media persona isn't supposed to be an act. It isn't even supposed to be the highlights of your life. It's supposed to be the real you. You are supposed to be only the best and most desirable parts of yourself. This is a more insidious form of control than normative judgment. Such judgment expects you to compromise your individuality in order to be accepted as normal, but trends expect you to transform your inner individuality in accordance with the social ideals. And as the social ideals change, your inner being must change with them. Indeed, if you are to be valued in such a society, you must develop a liquid identity that is able to constantly absorb the newest trends and make them part of your inner self. But this is not the only implication of the new forms of control diagnosed by Deleuze. There are many. For example, without the enclosed spaces of the institutions described by Foucault, there is no outside from which to oppose the status quo from. This point is perhaps best explained through a quote about fashion by the French sociologist and philosopher Jean Baudrillard. He writes that we cannot escape fashion, since fashion itself makes the refusal of fashion into a fashion feature. Blue jeans are a historical example of this. In other words, there is nothing that exists outside of fashion, because fashion integrates its own opposition into itself, leaving no room for genuine resistance. Similarly, the opposition to trends and the social order at large has itself become a trend and a feature of the social order. In this light, we might think of movements like the hippie movement, punk movement, or even the feminist movement. Because today, they have all become distinct styles, appearances that signify a particular aesthetic rather than an ideology or belief. This is because our contemporary forms of control do not operate by suppressing individuals, nor by stimulating self-repression in the individual, but by steering expression in specific directions. For example, if a feminist is demanding social change, the older forms of control would try to punish those views, inspiring fear in the feminist, or it would portray feminism as deviant and shameful, making the feminist self-conscious or self-suppressing. But today, feminism is being controlled by redirection towards social appearances. What clothes are feminists supposed to wear? What hashtags are they supposed to reproduce? What behaviors are they supposed to imitate? What moral judgments are they supposed to make? What talking points are they supposed to repeat? These forms of control do not steer feminism away from social change as such, but integrates the cry for social change into the social order itself. Opposition to the status quo thus becomes a feature of the status quo. Hashtag Black Lives Matter is another example of opposition to the social order becoming a feature of that social order, because only a small number of people who reproduce the hashtag will actually be willing to actively advocate for social change. If anything, demanding or supporting social change on social media can easily become a way of justifying passivity in the face of social injustice. This, however, is not limited to social media, but applies to all movements that emphasize performativity as a means to achieve social change. For example, in the book Woke Racism, the black intellectual John McWhorter argues that contemporary anti-racism is directly harmful to black Americans. He argues that making white people feel guilty and acknowledge their white privilege is far less important than, for example, ending the war on drugs, which has been proven to have been racially motivated as well as ineffective at inhibiting the spread of illegal drugs. I would argue that the emphasis placed on performativity over action is a particular quality of our current forms of control, and is a widespread phenomenon in all aspects of postmodern society. There's a lot more to say about all of this, but I can't say it all here, as there are too many aspects to be taken into account at this time. However, I am working on several videos to expand on some of the points I've touched on here. I'm currently working on a video about the historical development of social media, to try to understand how its mechanisms have impacted us and will continue to do so in the future. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss it. I'm also researching something I touched on several times in this video, and that is the postmodern society. This is a complex topic, and it'll be a while before I can make a video about it, but it'll be worth the wait. Now, if you want to learn more about Deleuze's take on control that inspired this video, I recommend watching videos by both Plastic Pills and Jonas Chaker, as they cover aspects of Deleuze's thinking that go beyond what I have explored here. I also recommend reading Foucault's Discipline and Punish, as it is a brilliant book, well deserving of your time. If you are hesitant, you should check out Rick Rodericks' lecture on the topic, which is so brilliant I rewatch it for pure entertainment value. But on my part, that's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye.